Hi, I'm Kripa Patel, an 11th grader here at Adams High School in the Social Justice Club, and this week we're going to be talking about the history of Women's History Month. The women's suffrage movement began in the 1820s and 30s officially, but started as early as the 1700s. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 consisted of a gathering formed by a group of abolitionist activists in Seneca Falls, New York, to have a discussion on what rights women should have. In 1849, the women's suffrage movement had made some progress, as the first state constitution passed in California had extended the right to property to all women in the state. In the 1850s and 60s, the movement was gaining some attention. However, the Civil War put the movement on halt as women began to put their efforts into the war. After the Civil War, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass, and many others came together to form the American Equal Rights Association in 1866. They formed the association with the goal of getting rights for all, regardless of race or gender. However, many large steps were taken backwards with the ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1868, exclusively stating that men were citizens and voters, but women were not. The ratification of this amendment caused several disagreements within the association, and they argued whether to support the proposed 15th Amendment. After the falling out of the American Equal Rights Association, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony formed the National Women's Suffrage Association in 1869 and began to fight for a universal suffrage amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Another group of women's suffrage activists, including Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell and others, founded the American Women's Suffrage Association in 1874 to fight for women's rights on a state level. In 1878, a very large step was taken as the Federal Women's Suffrage Amendment was presented to Congress. 4 years later, the National Council of Women in the United States was formed in 1888 to help promote advancements of women in the U.S. In 1890, the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association put aside their disagreements and combined to become the National American Women's Suffrage Association and appointed Elizabeth Cady Stanton as their first president. From around 1890 to 1925, the Progressive Era took place, allowing women from all classes and backgrounds to come into public life, which expanded the roles of women. This era brought women's suffrage to the mainstream public and to the mainstream politics. In 1896, the National Association for Colored Women was founded, joining many groups that were also fighting for women's rights at the time. By 1911, many states had started to adopt women's suffrage into their constitution. However, not everybody was quite as accepting of women's rights. In 1911, the National Association opposed for women's suffrage was organized. Although many were against equality for women, in 1912 there was a national support for the women's suffrage movement. After this national support, many states began to adopt women's suffrage, and in 1914, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns formed the National Woman's Party. As states continued to adopt suffrage for women and campaigning continued, the first ever woman was elected to the House of Representatives. Jeannette Rankin was elected to the House of Representatives in 1916 and was formally seated to the House in 1917. After some failed attempts by Rankin and other women's suffrage activists, the 19th Amendment was finally passed by the Senate in 1919 to later be ratified in 1920. The 19th Amendment declared that the states or the federal government could not deny a person the right to vote based on their gender. This allowed for all white women to have the right to vote. However, colored women still did not have suffrage. The ratification of the 19th Amendment did not mean equality for all women. Sadly, it took much longer for women of color to have rights and suffrage. In 1920, Native Americans were finally given full citizenship with the passing of the Indian Citizenship Act, but many states still made laws and policies that would prohibit Native Americans from voting. Several years later, in 1952, the Immigration and Nationality Act was passed, granting all Asian Americans the right to become citizens and to vote. 13 years later, Congress finally passed the Historic Voting Rights Act, removing any discriminatory barriers that were keeping many people of color from voting. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a great day.